lost all 4 fighters.
What? 2 dragons?
So Yonggary, yeah, this was a thing at one point. When it comes to monster movies, especially Godzilla movies, the general consensus amongst mainstream audiences is that these movies are typically bad, filled with bad acting, dialogue, directing, and laughable special effects. I am one who normally counter-argues such claims because not all monster movies fall under such categories. Yonggary, however, does fall under those categories. I actually got into this movie when I was a kid, so I didn't notice how bad this movie was at that time. It wasn't until I got older that I realized how bad this movie was, and when I did, boy did I feel so betrayed. To me, Yonggary was one of those things from my childhood I thought was so awesome, only to find out it was actually far from awesome when I revisited as an adult. The movie is actually a reboot / reimagining of the character Yonggary that originated from the 1967 film Yonggary Monster from the Deep. In fact, for the longest time, I didn't think that this movie was related to the 1967 Yonggary, because in the Korean language, the word Yonggary is derived from the Korean word for dragon. So for the longest time, I thought that both monsters coincidentally shared the same name. It's as if I created a kaiju of my own called Gargantua. It wouldn't be officially be related to Toho's War of the Gargantuas, now would it? But then I later found out in an interview where the director confirmed that his Yonggary is in fact a reimagining of the 1967 Yonggary. This reboot was supposed to be South Korea's break into the international market. It was supposed to challenge the status quo set by movies. And the film's director, Hyung-rae Shim, was going to lead that revolution. Unfortunately for Mr. Rae Shim and all of South Korea, that dream never became a reality. It shames me to say that at one point, Yonggary was the most expensive South Korean film produced at the time of its release. Because the movie does not look expensive. It looks cheap. Usually when I criticize some CG effects here and there, it's usually because it no longer leaves a sense of wonder to the imagination. Or sometimes, it's so overused that the film might as well be an animated movie. But in the case of Yonggary, the CG is just plain bad. The CG is poorly animated and poorly rendered. It looks unfinished. It looks like the same type of CG that was used for early sci-fi original movies. In fact, I actually thought that Yonggary was a sci-fi original movie for the longest time. It had all the telltale signs of a poorly produced sci-fi original movie. Terrible acting, terrible directing, terrible music, a poorly choreographed monster battle, and even far more terrible CG effects, and of course a cliche title, Reptilian. What's even more tragic is that the film was originally shot with rubber suits, but for some reason, they decided to replace the suits with CG during post-production. More than likely, this was an attempt to attract international appeal, a similar choice as to why only Western actors were cast. Speaking of the actors, the movie is not spared from terrible acting. There are a few actors here and there that seem to legitimately take their roles seriously, like Donna Phillipson, who plays Holly, and Harrison Young, who plays Dr. Hughes. But then there are some actors who seem to be aware that this movie is garbage and just delivered the most over-the-top performance they can deliver. The best example is Richard B. Livingston, who plays Campbell. This is a character that you just absolutely cannot take seriously. Just look at these masterful performances.
No! It isn't real! You're my creation! I made you!
Some of the actors are okay, but they're still not doing the movie any favors. The soundtrack by Chris Desmond is absolutely atrocious. It doesn't sound like monster music or movie music at all. It sounds like someone took a random keyboard and adapted an 8-bit video game soundtrack. Unfortunately for director Rae Shim, Yonggary did not turn out to be the blockbuster he had hoped, Instead, it became the Bible for how not to make a monster movie. Yonggary is plagued with hysterical flaws. Not on the same level as Tommy Wiseau's The Room, but if you're gonna attempt to make a big budget monster film that would break box office records, this is not the way to do it! It also shames me to say that the version of Yonggary that I'm reviewing, and the one that everyone saw, is the quote-unquote upgrade version. There are two versions to Yonggary. There's the original version released in 1999, and then there's the quote-unquote upgrade edition released in 2001. What's the difference? Well, quite a lot, actually. In the 1999 version, you never saw the aliens, only the ship. The actual aliens were filmed specifically for the 2001 version. In the 1999 version, Bud Black had a bigger role than he did in the 2001 version. According to the trailer for the 1999 version, there was a subplot that included Bud Black stealing the data disk from Dr. Hughes.
We're taking the disc to him.
Finders keepers!
In the 2001 version, this subplot was completely removed and Bud Black mysteriously disappears after Yonggary appears. In the 1999 version, they don't refer to Yonggary and Psychor as monsters, they refer to them as dragons, according to the trailer for the 1999 version.
Two dragons?
In the 1999 version, the command center where all the principal characters gathered looked very different. In the 2001 version, they shot new footage with a new command center. And speaking of new footage, the character Mills was not in the 1999 version. He was a character made specifically for the 2001 version, hence the new high-tech command center. Last but definitely least, the 2001 version features new CG effects and quote-unquote upgrades on the 1999 version's old CG. So to add insult to injury, not only are we watching a terrible movie, but we're watching the quote-unquote upgrade version of that movie. For some reason, the 2001 version is the only version of the movie available anywhere. The 1999 version has never been released on home video on any market. My guess is that the 2001 upgrade edition is Ray Shim's preferred definitive version of the movie. Kinda like how George Lucas prefers the Star Wars special editions as the definitive versions instead of the theatrical cuts. Hence why you never see the theatrical cuts on TV, DVD, or Blu-ray anymore. For some reason, Yonggary was released on home video in North America as Reptilian. My guess is that this was done to make the movie more marketable, but it seems to have started a trend amongst monster fans to call the monster Reptilian instead of Yonggary. Something I personally find annoying because Yonggary is never called Reptilian in the movie and has never officially gone under that alias. Overall, Yonggary is a stinker. It is the type of monster movie that mainstream audiences think how all monster movies are like, which again, is not always the case. It seems Yonggary is cursed from having a good movie. The original 1967 Yonggary has some camp value which I enjoy, but it's still ultimately a bad movie with a terrible soundtrack. The same can be said for the Yonggary reboot. It's an atrocious movie that I cannot recommend to anyone unless you're a huge fan of Sharknado, the Asylum movies, sci-fi original movies, or just bad movies in general. However, Yonggary has some replay value for me. Like I said, this was a movie I grew up watching as a kid, so I have some nostalgia for it. By no means do I think this movie is any good. I agree that it's total garbage. But it's garbage I enjoy seeing from time to time. Yonggary is the example of a movie that's dumb, but fun. It's a movie that's so bad, it's kinda good. And because of that, I'm giving Yonggary the mercy score of 1.5 stars out of 4.